this. I think it's 11, so we can now formally start the class. This is, by the way, the first time that Miami New Drama has ever done this. So bear with us. We're going to find this as we go through it. I don't know how many of you know, but Miami New Drama is a theater company housed at the Colony Theater on Miami Beach. We've been up and running about 4 years or so. I think what makes us a little bit different than other theater companies is that we are a company that creates work that is as multilingual, multicultural as the community we live in, which is Miami, and that we mainly do new work. And sort of in that spirit, our relationship with Aurin Squire has flourished. Aurin is exactly the type of writer that we sort of created Miami New Drama for. And we've collaborated already in 2 projects and a third one on the way. We couldn't think of anyone more qualified and exciting to start this masterclass series, which can also be translated series of classes you can do while you are not wearing pants, than Aurin Squire. Aurin really is the type of artist that we champion, that we love, that we just can't get enough. And so we wanted to share Aurin Squire with the world. So Aurin, we are going to start a little bit this conversation precisely as you were going. It's sort of like going through your journey to become the accomplished writer that you are. Let me just actually say a couple of things. Aurin is not only a published and produced playwright. His plays have been produced across the country and in Europe, mainly in England. And his work on television has been in all of your TVs or devices. He wrote a big part of the first season of This Is Us. And he also wrote, or is writing now, I don't know how many CBS writers are writing for 2 shows at the same time. Has to be a rarity, but Aurin is writing The Good Fight and Evil. And if that doesn't make him a genius, then in having, being in 2 writers' room, he also have time to write amazing works like A Wonderful World, which is a musical that is hibernating now at the Colony Theater. We did 6 preview performances, and we were just about to open it when we had to close down. It's the best work Miami Drama has ever done, and in no small part because it was written by Aurin and because it's political and exciting. So with that introduction,
thank you.
Aurin, tell us a little bit about the journey for you to become a writer. Where were you born? You don't have to say a year, but where in more or less what decade?
Mount Sinai Hospital on Miami Beach in the middle of a torrential rainstorm in which people were rowing down the street, as the mythology my parents tell me, as that goes. The water came all the way up to our doorstop. And I was raised in unincorporated Dade. So it didn't have a name. It's by the Dolphin Stadium. So back then we called it Opelika or Carroll City. About 10 years ago, it incorporated officially and became Miami Gardens. But for a lot of us growing up here, we still call it like Opelika just because we call the stadium Joe Robbie Stadium, just because that's the way we grew up. We don't accept the new name. I went to Highland Oaks Elementary School in Aventura, Highland Oaks Middle School, and then North Miami Beach. I had almost 0 involvement in the arts growing up. I think I saw 2 plays. One was Dreamgirls at Miami-Dade Community College when I was at kindergarten. My parents dragged me to this community college version of Dreamgirls. I had no idea what the show was about. I remember, this was over 30 years ago. All I remember is that there were a lot of sparkly dresses. There was a huge amount of dry ice. I'd never seen dry ice before as a kid. I just remember this wave of white smoke wafting over, but it was cool, and and then the singing was phenomenal, and there was some cat fighting between the women. That's what I remember as a child watching. I was like, oh, these women kind of sing together, but they don't like each other, and it's very sparkly. and there's a lot of smoke, and this is exciting. And then years went by, and maybe it was third or fourth grade, Highland Oaks Elementary drove us out into Broward County to see a production of Midsummer Night's Dream that was being performed by a touring troupe. And it was in an empty theater, and the kids were, you know, only filled up a third of it. And the troupe acted in the aisles. They performed Midsummer Night's Dream in the aisles and among the kids. And that was the two plays I saw growing up. I didn't see anything on any other plays until I went to college, but I did have the advantage of growing up in Miami in the 80s and 90s, where there was a bunch of great storytellers on radio. So growing up, I listened to 560 and then 610 WIOD. And so I grew up listening to Rick and Suds, Neil Rogers, Chaz McKay, even though a lot of people didn't like Chaz back then, I liked him. I was cool with them. Randy Rhoads and Phil Hendry. And these were the ultimate storytellers because it's audio. They don't have any visual. They would sit there in front of a mic and they could unspool a story for 2 hours and then incorporate calls into the story. This combination of narrative storytelling, improvisation, and then including the audience in these little sections. And I remember one time I was driving around and Randy Rhoads had just gone to Home Depot, and she sat down and began to tell a story about Home Depot that may have lasted 1 or 2 hours. And it was funny, it was personal, it was like literary nonfiction. It had calls, she had commercial breaks, she had like act breaks like you do in TV, where she had to take a commercial break. And these people were, or are, in my opinion, geniuses of storytelling. When I switched over and I listened to Howard Stern one day, Howard Stern isn't anything in comparison to Miami radio in the 80s and 90s. Doesn't even hold a candle to Neil Rogers, to Phil Hendry, who is still a genius, although he moved to LA. These are people who had skits, who then would storytell, and then they would have stuff they wrote, and then they would incorporate the audience like the best improvisational performers. And so I grew up worshiping and admiring these sort of local heroes. And
how did you get into journalism then? Because that was your next, you know, your first try at storytelling was journalism.
Well, I was at North Miami Beach High School. I played football, I wrestled, I was on the debate team. So I knew some of the local reporters because they would put me in the paper for different events.
So you're an overachiever, Aurin. From very young, you've been an overachiever. Is that?
Well, I was trying to avoid playing my Nintendo. So my mom said, get out of the house. So I did football. Then someone said, you know, if you really do football, you should do wrestling too, because that's good in the off season. So then I started doing wrestling. And then there's a section where football and wrestling season overlaps. So I do football and wrestling, and then I go on Saturday morning and do like debate tournaments. And so it trained me in having a different sleep schedule. I would come home and immediately go to sleep after practice, wake up at 1 or 2 a.m. after like 6 hours of sleep, and then work all the way up to school began. But I knew a lot of the reporters in the local newspapers, and they would invite me in to just sit with them. I visited a college, and this college professor said, if you have an internship and you aren't writing articles, then you're wasting it. So I came back from that visit at Washington and Lee University, and I asked the editor, Larry Bluestein, at the Hollandale Digest, I said, you should let me write for you. And he was like, no, get out of here. That's crazy. I was like, no, you should let me write an article. Let's see how this goes. So I wrote an article about the media in Miami, about sensationalistic media on WSVN, Channel 7, back when they were first starting up, Fox, and they had these, you know, Rick Sanchez and these ridiculous stories where he'd be like crouched over a map explaining crime, and they would do these things sensationalized, like a bike getting stolen in North Miami Beach, to make it seem like it was a bank heist. And so I wrote this article about sensationalistic media, and I didn't think anything of it. I went back to school, and my English teacher, read that article I wrote, and she handed me a James Joyce book. She said, oh, you're a writer. And I was like, no, I'm not. She's like, well, here's James Joyce. You should read Portrait of a Young Man as an Artist. So I read that book. I was like, all right, this is vaguely interesting. And I needed a job. I applied to every single Bennigan's, every single TGIF, every single Chili's, and I got turned down by all of them. I applied to Cox Communications, and I applied to be an intern. I got turned down by that. So I went back to Larry Bluestein at Hallandale Digest, and I said, you should give me a job. And he was like, we don't have any money. And I was like, no, just let me write. So I wrote a few more articles, and they got attention, and the publisher invited me into his office saying, we're getting letters about the things you're writing. That's great. And that's when I reiterated, you should pay me for doing this. And he was like, we don't have any money. I was like, let's negotiate. And so I grew up around a dad who loved bargaining and negotiation. So to me, it's a game. I'm like, oh, let's negotiate. How much money? I'm going to bring in this amount. You can give me this amount of money for the articles I wrote. So they agreed. And at that time, Hallandale Digest switched to becoming the Digest. And then they opened up a second newspaper called the Aventura Times or Aventura Digest. And then I started writing for that. And then they opened up a third newspaper called the Pembroke Pines Digest. So I was writing for 3 newspapers in high school, and that's what I was doing to get paid. And then online media and blogs erupted. And so I started writing for a magazine in New York City called The Resistance. And then I started writing for a magazine in LA or in Southern California. So by the time I graduated, I was writing for 5 different publications, 3 local newspapers and 2 online e-zines.
So, okay, Aurin. So before we proceed, so you were hustling, you were trying to negotiate a payment for the work you did when you were a high school student. Do you think that dynamic has changed, or as your career has continued, you've sort of, the role of a writer or of an artist is one in which you sort of still need to hustle to get money or prove that what you're doing is worth paying for? Have you seen a change in that?
No, I mean, now I have representation, but I still love reading a contract and getting in there. And I remember for This Is Us, they wanted to pay me a certain amount. And I was like, no. And my agents were like, this is a good deal. And I was like, this is not a deal I'm willing to accept based upon the cost benefit ratio. And I do a cost benefit ratio where I break down what are the costs of doing this job, of moving all the way to LA, and what's the benefits of it. And I was like, this ratio doesn't match. And so I explained that to them. It's not that I'm being a diva or I'm trying to be difficult, I'm trying to be greedy. I do an honest assessment of, this is the amount of work I'm going to do. These are the different steps. Here's how much each part costs, and this is the pay that equals that. And so we negotiated, and they paid me more. And we went back and forth, and my agents kept saying, like, are you sure? And I was like, I told them, I will sit out this job. I do not need this job. The amount of money and energy it takes to move out to LA is not worth what you want to pay me at. And then they came back and paid me at the rate that I wanted to. So sometimes, even if you have agents or lawyers, you have to be your own negotiator, because they're just happy for money. And sometimes you have to go like, no. You don't understand what this is going to require me to do.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, you're graduating high school, and you're applying to college. What did you want to major in, and what type of schools did you apply, and I know where you eventually ended up.
Based upon radio down in Miami and the journalism I was doing, I wanted to work for NPR. I wanted to be a radio journalist so bad, and maybe write articles for the New Yorker. But I thought, sitting in front of a microphone for 4 hours and telling you about how I went to the grocery store would be the most amazing thing in the world, and taking calls. So I applied to Northwestern because I was watching a football game one Saturday, and the running back from Northwestern had my middle name. And I looked up Northwestern, and I found out it had a great...
What is your middle name?
Autry. So it said, Autry takes the ball. And I was like, oh, that's my middle name. And I had a Peterson College guide on my parents' kitchen table. So I opened it up and I looked up Northwestern, and it said, excellent journalism school. So I applied to Northwestern. I got accepted. And then when I got the acceptance letter, you get the first letter that says, congratulations, you've been accepted. And then you get the second letter, which tells you what school. And for some reason, I accidentally got put in the School of Arts, the School of Communication. I swear I thought I applied to Medill, and maybe I put radio in there somewhere, and the people reading my application must have misread that and put me in radio, TV, and film, which is the arts program in the School of Communication, as opposed to radio journalism in Medill, the School of Journalism. So I was freaking out, and I called around, and when I got to Northwestern, I was gonna change my major to journalism. And in order to leave a school, you have to sit down with the dean to do an exit interview. And the dean told me, or negotiated, or whatever she said, you should stay here. Barbara O'Keefe, I think her name. It's like, you should stay here in radio, TV, and film. And I said, I don't know anything about radio, TV, and film. I've seen 2 plays my entire life. And, you know, the only thing my parents watched was The Cosby Show. And she said, you can do all the journalism you want and take all the journalism classes, because Medill is so difficult. People are dropping out of it all the time. But the School of Communications, which back then was called the School of Speech, she said, everyone wants to get into radio, TV, and film. And if you leave this program, you will be at the bottom of the wait list if you try to take a film class. And so I looked at the curriculum, and radio, TV, and film is such a flexible curriculum. 2/3 of your required classes are outside of film. So they expect people who are film majors to become a worldly scholars and other things that they can bring to film. So my goal was, I was going to do journalism and work as a journalist while getting a degree in radio, TV, and film, and then also focusing on Russian literature, which I was fascinated with back that time, and took a lot of Russian literature classes. And so that's what I did until I had to write a script as a film major for one of my labs. It was a radio lab, going back to radio. And so I sat and wrote the script of this sketch that I was gonna do, bringing in the spirit of Phil Hendry and Neil Rogers. And I wrote this sketch, and I did all the different voices, and I edited it together, and I had my co-partner do a few voices, and then I added like a fake commercial, like I was listening to the 610 WID. And I gave it to my professor, and the professor said, like, who did all these voices? And I said, I did. It's like, who wrote the script? I said, I wrote the script. He's like, who edited? I was like, I edited the script. And he said, you should consider writing. And I was like, no, I do write. I'm a journalist. And he's like, you should consider writing fiction because you have, I guess, a good ear. What he didn't know was my work study job was at Northwestern's news feed, where I interviewed professors all day for radio interviews. So my work study job, all 4 years in Northwestern, I'd interview a professor. I would take their raw audio, and I would chop it into sound bites. So I had to transcribe stuff. So I had to listen to every and like and and pause, and I had to edit that out. So I guess I was more aware of the syntax and rhythms of people's speech, and also loving radio, talk radio from the 80s. I was more aware of like how each person has a voice that's like a fingerprint, and how they talk is like a fingerprint, utterly unique. So from that, I applied to the creative writing program in the media at Northwestern, and that's really when I thought, okay, I should start taking fiction writing more seriously, because I had to write screenplays, plays, TV, as well as journalism in the creative writing program in the media the last 2 years at Northwestern.
Well, it's impressive what an overachiever you've always been. And as an artistic director, it has always been my experience that we speak about, creating a play, and then like a few weeks later, you come with a fully written play, and you say, well, it's not final, but like I've never had that experience with another writer who would just sit down and do the work that quickly. I mean, I think that, I don't know if you notice how much of an overachiever you are, and I don't think that I think you do it for yourself. No, I mean, but I've always, this whole story, this whole narrative is of an overachiever. Do you see yourself as that?
No, I'm writing, and from the background of the workmen, the yeomen of radio and newspaper, you crank out content. And in the newspaper days, there's no such thing as writer's block. You have writer's block, you're fired. So if I had 3 articles due, you just crank them out. It isn't a big deal. I think I've carried that work ethic over into fiction writing, where it's like, this is the deadline. You complete the deadline. Even if you write junk, you have to complete something. And so I'm used to that. And when I went to Northwestern and I took creative writing classes, I was amazed that people would say, oh, I didn't work on the assignment. And I was like, what do you mean you didn't work on the assignment? That doesn't compute with me. You have a computer, you sit before your computer, you punch keys, and then words come out. Like, you couldn't do that. And there was this concept, this psychological concept that was introduced, I guess, in the late 19th century of romanticism about artists, that you have like writer's block. It's like in newspaper, you don't have writer's block, you just write it. You don't have radio block. If you're on the air, words come out of your mouth. And so in my opinion, I just let the characters talk, and as they're speaking, I'm just transcribing what they're saying. It might not be good, but it is content that I can then manipulate and use later.
So we are now, I should have said this at the beginning, the way that this masterclass was going to be structured. So the first part was, seeing Aurin's journey from, a kid to a playwright. And then which is the section we are soon going to start, we're going to actually talk about the craft and how Aurin creates the craft, creates the character, the plots, and how really a play goes from his head to a fully produced a show. And then we'll end the session, the last 30 minutes or so, with questions and answers from you guys. So there is a way for you to raise your hands that we'll share shortly. You can.
Bye. Stay well. See you next week. Stay well.
Let's try to mute everyone. Okay. And so we're gonna slowly start now into talking about the craft of writing. So, but first, Aurin, let's finish. You are now. In your trajectory, you are now sort of starting to understand how fiction works, because you understand how people, your first understanding was how characters work, because you spend a lot of time hearing people and understand the different cadence and understand how the way you speak it's unique to yourself. So from then on, how did fiction, so you now understand how a character works, but now how did you learn about plot?
Well, I went to New School for grad school when it was a part of the.
Hold on a second. So when you applied to grad school, what were you focusing on your master's? What was your master's on?
I wanted to go for playwriting because someone told me if I got a degree in playwriting, that would cover TV and screenwriting.
Hold on. So but by the time you left Northwestern, you knew you wanted to be a fiction writer, yes?
Yeah, and I also saw a lot of plays for the first time, and I thought, this is incredible. It's not just old dead white men who are writing plays. I just thought it was like Shakespeare and people who died a few hundred years ago. And on Northwestern, I would go see my friends in these amazing shows like Pippin, Kiss of the Spider Woman, Frankie and Johnny, and I was introduced to theater as a living form. And so when I came back to Miami after graduating, I worked for In Focus Interactive Magazine as a managing editor, Globe Street as the Miami bureau chief. And then I worked for another magazine, but I was still writing fiction. And Globe Street, once again, it's content. I had to crank out 3 articles a day, 5 days a week, and then go to different jobs. So I would just crank out the articles, then go to In Focus Interactive, and then I would write at night. And I thought I should apply to grad school. And everyone says I should go to New York City. So I looked up the New York City grad schools.
Right, but hold on a second. Let me just pause you for a second before we go on. I just want to understand how, in your mind, you knew how to write nonfiction because you were a journalist, right? Yeah. But and then suddenly you understood that you could write characters. But what happened in your brain that sort of like allow you to do fiction? Because for you it comes natural, but for many people it doesn't. Like how did in your brain, how in your train of thoughts, how did you decide to create a world where there wasn't one?
Well, doing the radio interviews at Northwestern, I took my first playwriting class in the creative writing program that was done by Susan Booth, who was the associate artistic director at the Goodman Theater at the time. And I think she's now in Atlanta. And she taught our playwriting class, and I just went with voices in my head. And I would use the voices to get into arguments. And I knew I'd studied basic theater. I took an intro to theater class and read Oedipus Rex. And so I thought, like, okay, I'm just gonna move these pieces around like I'm playing with toys, like toy dolls in my head. And now this person says this, and now this person says that. And I would just let them speak. and then record what they were saying. It was very rough. But at the end of the playwriting class, Susan Booth pulled me aside and she said, so what is the inspiration for this play I wrote, which was set in Miami which was a dark comedy? And thought I was like cribbing off of someone. I knew nothing about playwriting. I said, there is no inspiration. I wrote it. And she was like, but
what play was that?
It's called Xmas with the Pinuels, or Christmas with the Pinuels. And it's like a Black family in Miami, very dark comedy that involves murder and a father trying to sell the house that his family's living in while they're still in it without them knowing. It involves like all sorts of things. And it was just something to entertain myself. And usually I go with, does this make me laugh? Does this surprise me? And if I let the characters talk, I wait until they say something surprising and then I go with that. I go, oh my God, I didn't expect you to say that. So it's almost like you have to, like a golem, Michelle, like a golem, you animate it, use the clay of words to animate the character. And like a golem, you write their goal on their forehead and you let them go. And then these two golems interact with each other and then you're like, oh, write this down. And then once you're finished with the scene, you erase the words from their forehead and they fall back to clay. They fall back to dirt. They fall back to the words. And so when you're creating a character, what is their goal? What is their dream? What is their initiative? If you can picture it and visualize it as a clay object you're building up with words and characteristics and behaviors, and then write their dream on their forehead, and then take another character and build them up with syntax, write their dream on their forehead, and it's almost like a key in the ignition, and then let them go and see how they interact. And then when you're done, turn the key or write another goal on their head, wipe that goal off and write another goal and see how they interact. Until you get the most interesting interaction of these two animated figures, that's when you have something. When it entertains you as an audience member and you're sitting back like, oh my God, this is great what they're saying.
So I have a question, sorry. So that goal, are you writing a different goal from each scene, or is there an overarching goal for each character that you write and that is sort of like their ultimate goal all the time?
Usually I'm not that sophisticated. I begin with a very small goal, and then in the middle of it, they will say something about a dream they had. And then like a therapist, you sit there and analyze their dream as they're laying, you look at their words like they're on the couch, you're like, what does that mean? They actually want this. They don't, the hunger for a pizza as actually underlying the fact that their wife just left them. So is this play about that, or what's this person dealing with? You begin analyzing that, and then you write something else on their forehead and let them go. I remember I wrote a play that was supposed to be just a scene between an interracial couple. And someone said, just write 10 pages. And it ended up being 90 pages because they just started talking. And I was like, oh, this is the point of this. And I said, well, I need to continue this conversation. So the easiest way to do that when you're talking about a couple relationship is to give them a baby, or to give them a house, or to give them something. So by the end of the first scene, she finds out it finally happened. The test came back positive. We're going to have a baby. And I go, now we're off to the races. Now they have to form a family. And now this allows the structure of their relationship to cross across her being pregnant, her giving birth to a baby, his eyes starting to wander, and all these things happen. But it really began as a 5 or 10 page scene of this interracial couple talking to a reporter, doing an online interview to a reporter about what does it mean to be an interracial couple. And it evolved into actually it's about forming a family and how their identities come together and at the same time conflict at some points.
So it's really interesting, Aurin, that most play or a lot of people telling stories would think of what is the big arc and then sort of write the characters. But if I'm understanding correctly, the way you write is that you're fascinated first with characters, and then the characters are the ones that will dictate the plot. Is that more or less how you work?
Yes, I think writers are good at two things naturally. You're either good at world building, like if you watch video games or big epics, you're good at creating like science fiction dystopia, or you're good at character building. And you have to decide where your story is coming from. If you gravitate towards characters talking first, and then you form the world around them as they're talking and explaining things, or the opposite. If you like forming the world first, of we live in a dystopic future where everyone's stuck inside, and no one can go outside, otherwise they'll die of a deadly plague. And you go, so what's the most interesting character I can create in this dystopic future? Someone who is afraid of staying inside, or someone who misses their child, or someone who's trying to get back, who got stuck in a particular area. And then you build out. So either you work inside out or you work outside in.
Right. So it's interesting because most of the plays that we've worked together, you know, the Miami Drama has commissioned you, are plays in which the world exists, right? Because we've done together Confessions of a Cocaine Cowboy with Billy Corbin, who was your co-writer, and A Wonderful World, which is about the life of Louie Armstrong. And so we, in a way, gave you two worlds that you had to sort of contain yourself with. So, and I've also am completely in love with your other plays. As you know, we first met when my agent at the time gave me a copy of Defacing Michael Jackson. And I thought it was outstanding, by the way. And then I read all of your other plays, which, if I'm not mistaken, I think like 90% of them happen in Miami.
Yeah, right? Like 50%, 60% happen in Miami.
Yeah, well, maybe 90% of the ones you send me, because you crack a play a week or something. But which was interesting because you were being produced across the country, especially your Miami plays, and nobody in Miami was really aware of the work you were doing. But anyways, now they are. So, so I knew how you created, you know, and again, you're working a lot, I think, biographically in places like Defacing Michael Jackson, etc. So how did you able to manage the idea of limitations? So if you have to write about Louie Armstrong, or you have to write about the story and the characters around the movie Confessions, about the movie Cocaine Cowboy. So how does that process differ from writing the other work we were just talking about?
Well, I work with Tectonic's company on a project about
Kaufman, the co-founder of Miami Drama.
And this was out in Albuquerque, and the project was about converso crypto Jews, people who fled the Spanish Inquisition and resettled in Mexico City, and then fled when the Inquisition started in Mexico City to Southern California, but also really New Mexico and Arizona, because rich Spaniards did not want to live in New Mexico and Arizona. There wasn't gold or the prospects there. So a lot of Jewish people hiding their identity fled to New Mexico, and the Spanish government just sort of let them stay over there if they colonized and pacified the Native American population. And so in Albuquerque, we worked on something called moments work, which is finding the visual picture, finding that moment. The moment can be nonverbal, or the moment can be an interaction or something surprising. And so I would just collect these moments together, and I would just jot down, this is a moment, this is a moment, that is a moment. And so when reading about Louie Armstrong, or reading the court transcripts for Confessions of a Cocaine Cowboy, I would just jot down moments. And 90% of the moments you're not going to use, but the moments start flipping down like tarot cards on a table. They start becoming these cards of moments. And usually your mind, your unconscious mind, is 1,000,000 times smarter than your conscious mind. So I think the biggest part of me getting stuck is when my conscious mind begins judging stuff and tries to pre-edit and it's like, no, just moment, just put them out on the table like cards. And you keep throwing them out. And then eventually, I'm going to switch metaphors from cards to a jigsaw puzzle. You notice that, oh, this card and that card match. And so you cobble that together. You notice this card and that card match. So you put that together. And then you start matching cards together, and those become scenes. And then you take all of these matching piles of cards, and you try to find a narrative arc, and you go, okay, this card tells this beginning story, this pile of cards tells a bunch of scenes from the middle, this pile of cards tells the scenes from the end. And once you have a beginning, middle, and end, you have a play, you have a novel, you have a TV show, you have a movie. All you have to do is fill in the middle. The most important stuff is that most people read about are the beginning and ends of stories. And in Defacing Michael Jackson, it was an exercise taught by Rogelio Martinez, a Cuban writer, when I was an intern at New Dramatists.
And Miami New Drama is working with, commission him a new play, but continue.
Great. Yeah, exactly. And he got us to write a play in like 20, 30 minutes. We wrote the first scene, which was setting up a visual of someone talking. We wrote a second scene, which is two other characters talking. We wrote a third scene where the person from the first scene and a person from the second scene interact because something has happened in the world that is changing the dynamic of their ritual that they're setting up. Then we wrote another scene in which another character is giving a monologue about the world's changed, everything's changed now. And then we wrote a final scene being like, well, everything's changed. And when we finished the exercise, he's like, okay, now you have a play. And we're like, what do you mean now we have a play? It's like, you have a beginning, you have a middle, you have an end. Go in and just fill the rest. And so I went home, and it was, I was staying at Malton House on 8th Street and 5th Avenue in New York City, and it was Gay Pride, and the Gay Pride Parade wraps around the building. So you're sort of stuck inside, unless you're, I mean, it's packed, person to person. So I was inside that day, and I sat and I took out the 4 or 5 scenes I wrote from Rogelio Martinez's exercise, and I started writing the in-between scenes, and that became Defacing Michael Jackson. It became the 20-minute play, which was published and was done a bunch of places, and then it became the full-length play. But it started from finding out what's that beginning pile of cards that's provocative, what's that middle pile of cards, and what's the end. And those are like columns in the house that you can use.
But it's interesting because that play actually is structurally almost perfectly, because there is sort of the beginning of the idea. We are going to create this mural, the creation of the mural, the development of the relationships, the coming of age, the coming out. So, you know, that it feels strange for somebody who have read it. I would have always imagined that because the thread is so beautifully created that you first created that and then filled in the rest. So it's fascinating for me that that's not how it happened, but rather it was first a big mess that then was put together and divided into moments, and that created the arc. Whereas
it's an exercise from Marie Irene Fornes, also a great playwright, and Rogelio taught it to us, and every single intern produced an astonishing play, or at least the beginning of an astonishing play, because it was based in a childhood ritual. And we talked about what is something you did as a child that formed a community, that that existed for a temporal existence for a set amount of time, and that disintegrated when you became older or when you moved away or something. And so we talked about different childhood rituals that had to form a community, it had to bring new people into your world, and then they had to fall apart for whatever reason. And mine was watching the Thriller tape, because our family had a VCR, one of the first families that had a VCR. Everyone has these childhood rituals they did. I did this exercise a few years ago at college, and someone talked about their mother used to make them stitch their own clothes and make their own clothes. And the fall apart was when she went to high school, all the cool kids were wearing designer clothes, and she was embarrassed wearing handmade clothes. And I'm getting choked up because the story is a lot more powerful than that. At a certain point, she throws away the mother's advice, and now she's wearing designer clothes. And then her mother passes away, and she realizes that thing formed a community. That thing formed not only a skill set, but was a bonding ritual with her mother. And then it went away. And so it's something she looked back on as an adult with regret and sadness. And so if you look at things you did as a child, things you have, things that formed a community, whether you made sandcastles or stitched your own clothes or watched a certain tape, what is that thing that then sort of fell apart when you grew up? And that's a ritual that you can write about that has a beginning, middle, and end.
Okay, we have a couple of questions, or we'll have a question, a Q&A time later, but somebody wants for you to explain what the 20-minute exercise play, the 20-minute play exercise that you spoke of was, and then the name of the play and the name of the teacher and outline of the exercise.
Okay, I'm gonna explain this. I have actually a document, I think, somewhere that explains this. I'm going to
We
explain
have
this
everyone's email, so we can share afterwards material with
yeah.
who are here.
I'm going to explain this on the fly, which is a few things. So you think of 3 childhood rituals. They say 3 instead of 1 so that your mind begins jogging. And actually, a lot of times you might choose a second or third one. Think of 3 childhood rituals you can do that formed a community of people, of your family and other people. And you could always create fictional characters. You think of something that made you feel good, allowed you to have a new identity or place in the world, and then you think of how it had to fall apart at some point. And in Hollywood, we call these coming of age stories. So in this one, we call it childhood rituals. But if you look at coming of age stories like, you know, Lean on Me or whatever, with the boys taking a trip, they all have the same structure. So the first scene is you, the narrator, or the person leading this ritual. And so Rogelio Martinez said, I want you to take 2 minutes and begin writing. I want you to explain the ritual and the world that's being created. So we started writing for a minute, and then he said, okay, pause after a minute. He said, write light shift. And now we're in the actual ritual. And then I was like, okay, in the actual ritual, I'm just writing. Now we're in the ritual. I'm setting up the chairs. I'm setting up the tables for people to begin doing, people to come in and watch the Michael Jackson Thriller video. And then that's the first scene. That's the prologue of you explaining the world. And so Defacing Michael Jackson begins 1984, Opelika, Florida. It's setting up like these are things happening. And the world can't get enough of Michael Jackson. And it goes da-da-da-da-da, and then goes light shift. And now we're in the actual world that we're doing. So if it's stitching clothes, whatever it is, you know, you're having that interaction, and then you're stitching the clothes. The second scene, if that's character A, the second scene is character B and C. B and C are supporting characters, and they're talking, and they're doing something and getting ready to go to the ritual. They're getting ready to go to the thing. And B or C has new information about something changing or something happening. In my case, it was a family moving into a new neighborhood. For the woman who was talking about stitching her own clothes, it might have been a mall opening up in the town, in the small town, or a new store with fancy clothes opening up. And B and C are having this conversation like, did you hear there's this new mall with these great clothes? We have to go. It's designer. They're from Paris and New York. You know, finally something to get out of this small town rut. And we got to go tell character A. And so then you go to the third scene, which is either B or C run into the scene where character A is talking. Character A is still going through the ritual, and they're explaining, oh my God, this is going to be so great, blah, 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 blah. And then character B or C runs on. I was like, oh my God, like an ancient Greek theater, they're a herald. They run on stage and like, we have news of something that is approaching. And so now you have the first 3 scenes. And for that, you take 2 minutes. For the second scene between B and C, you may take 2 minutes. You just write out banter. And the whole point is they're releasing new information. The third scene where character B or C runs on to the scene with character A, you take 2 minutes and just write out banter. And they're telling character A, this new thing is happening. Jump ahead to, if B was talking to character A, then this next scene is the character you didn't use. So character C has a monologue where they're like, man, I can't stand that these things have changed. I hate that now this thing, and you leave it open. You'll fill that in later. But character B is telling the audience, man, ever since Johnny moved into town, things have been awful. Ever since that store opened up, no one's stitching their own clothes anymore. And our knitting circle has broken up, and I miss seeing my friends and yada, yada, yada. That takes about a minute or 2. And then the final scene, you write light shift, and then that character who's delivering the monologue has a final scene with your A character, and they have an argument over something. And the argument is over something literal and small, but the argument is actually a cover. The subtext of that argument is, I am sad that this ritual is ending. I am angry that this community is over, and I blame you. But the actual text of the argument might be, you left the knitting needle out and I almost stuck myself. How dare you? Or whatever it is, it's an excuse that they're trying to get into an argument because they know it's breaking up and they want to be the ones to break it up first. But there's an underlying sadness of like, I feel betrayed. I feel like this is ending, and I'm angry, and I'm lashing out at the people closest to me, which is you. And then you add a final scene if you want to, which is the epilogue. Character A's talking. The community has broken apart. It's 10 years later. It's 20 years later. It's 30 years later, and you're an adult, and you're looking back on the ritual you did, making your own clothes. And then from that, you have, you reflect back on that time, and you think about the good and the bad, and you have a beginning, middle, and end of a play. And then you take a break, whether it's a few hours, or for me, it was like a week or two, and you come back to it and you look at what you have and you just fill in the scenes in between. What was that thing character B or C was talking about? In my case, it was a white family moving in, and then you add those 4 or 5 scenes in the middle, and then you add in the scenes in between the middle and the end. And you have a 30-minute play, or you have an hour-long play, whatever it is, or 2 hour.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because as you were describing this, so many movies that I've seen sort of, for example, A League of Their Own, what for some reason, that I feel, oh my God, it has the exact same structure. There's a reality, then there's new information that is going to change that reality, then the reality changes, then we see the reality change, we see the repercussions of it, and then we see the community that was formed, the community that breaks up, and then we return to it at the end, and we see what was lost with distance, right? So it's interesting that model sort of repeats in so many plays, and
because it's ancient. We all have things we did as a child that in the back of our mind we know we're going to lose at a certain point when we grow up. The toys, we're going to have to put aside our toys and put aside our childish things, as the Bible would say. And there's a bittersweetness to realizing that as a teenager, when you're in that transition, or as a young adult, when you're in that transition of putting away stuff. And then when you're an older adult, a lot of people return to that. A lot of people return to watching Michael Jackson tapes or making their own clothes. And now they return to with all this awareness, with maybe some happiness, maybe some sadness, but time has passed. So if you could just think of 3 or 4 childhood rituals you used to do, I think for me, it was also making these arepa type things with my sister. We didn't know what those were. We just like fry dough and then take strips of beef and fry that and then wrap them in that and then dip them in ketchup. And the easy bake oven was another ritual. Like, think of just things you used to do. We used to go walking to the canal where people would drown in our neighborhood. Think of just activities that you should go outside and do, or things you used to do inside with your siblings, with your family members. My family would read Reader's Digest around the table, and we would go through the word bank, and my dad would quiz us on the word bank. That's a ritual. It's small. It doesn't have to be huge. That's a small ritual of like, I want my kids to be educated, so I'm going to read Reader's Digest, and I'm going to quiz them on and see if they know these words. Think about those, and you have stories. And everyone has hundreds of things you used to do. And even things you're doing now that you're not going to do 10 or 15 years from now, that's a ritual. The place you're working at, where you're now on hiatus from, those rituals that you're doing that now have been suspended, those are all things you can write about. Right.
So that's funny because that's actually Jordan Levin's, who's a wonderful writer, journalist. That's actually her question, which is, does the exercise work about a memory in your 20s or your 30s?
Absolutely. They just say childhood rituals because they're more powerful, but they could do stuff in college, stuff you did 10 years ago, stuff you did 5 years ago, that as long as it forms a community, allows you to have a new or very specific identity that you may have not had before among this community. And then at a certain point, what are the tensions within that begin as time shifts that are beginning to break that apart?
Interesting. Now, so we're now talking about about something very personal, about something, about a memory of yours. But I also know you as a writer, and you are able to write about things that are not at all part of your growing up, or you write about
when you put yourself
or Louie Armstrong,
in Louie Armstrong's shoes as that child. You put yourself in the drug cartel hitman shoes and you think about the rituals they used to do, and you gain one of the things that Paula Vogel talked about with theater that's most crucial in a democracy, which is theater trains us in empathy. Because if you're writing or directing, you have to put yourself in the villain's shoes. You have to put yourself in the hero's shoes and then see like, oh, this is what the drug cartel hitman does every day. He goes to this restaurant, he has these things, he loves his kids, but then he kills 30 people. Right. Or this is what Louie Armstrong, this is what he was longing for as a child. Right. But then he grows up and he's missing.
But right, and we'll talk about those plays in detail in a second, but how, you know, in order to understand that world, does your journalist brain comes back to sort of research and understand, you know, a world which you were never part of? Like how much of actual research and reading, and, you know, you were not born in, you know, in the 1920s Chicago, but yet you wrote an impressive chapter about it with the extreme level of detail. Like how is your process in entering worlds that are foreign to you?
Well, I think Jose Rivera has an essay that our teacher, Laura Maria Sentabella, showed us, and I could send that to you. It's in my file somewhere, about writing. And I remember one of the sentences says, you write with your tongue, you write with your ass, you write with your nose, you write with, and so as I'm trying to trigger my senses, I will look up what I had to write Nueva Canción about the protest music in Chile. I looked up the foods that people were eating. I read the poetry of Pablo Neruda. I looked up the things from that time, and I tried to attach my actual senses to it. Like, oh, I'm eating this food. I'm listening to this music. This is what tactile, this is what it actually feels like to my senses. And then that's an entry point. Your senses are gateways into your imagination when you're trying to transport yourself 500 years in the past or 50 years ago, wherever you are, into the future. I was working on someone who was writing a screenplay. I was working on adapting their novel into a screenplay, and she had written this pretty impressive novel about working in the Tennessee Valley authorities as the first Black woman. And I just asked her, by the way, what did it smell like in the Valley, in Tennessee Valley, when you were working in these farms? And it transported her. She was like, oh my God, I forgot all these memories. And she started talking about all these things, and the actual smell of the Tennessee Valley and the actual smell of that area unveiled a whole other level of story. So your memories are trapped in your nose. They're trapped in your tongue. They're trapped in your ass. And the research goes there too. It goes into those actual things. Sex and food and music are the things that are ways of opening up your senses and doing research.
Well, that is impressive, and I'm just so at awe. In, you know, you created for a wonderful world. For those, I don't know how many of you were able to see the 6 preview performance we did, but the play is broken up in 4 distinct chapters. The first chapter is Louis' early years in New Orleans, and then in the riverboat. The second chapter, it's about sort of his coming of age. Musically speaking, with his relationship with Lil Harding in Chicago. By the way, each chapter is divided by each wife. The man had 4 wives. I don't know why I'm the one describing it, since you're the one who wrote it. But yes. Why don't you finish it? But I just want to. The point of the question is that both 4 worlds seem, Aurin, so specific. And even in the way people speak, in the way people interact, in the, you know, and also you created completely different worlds. The world of New Orleans has sort of like a different IQ level than the level of Chicago, which is sort of like, you know, everybody there is sort of like a brilliant musician. And so, you know, I just really want us to unpack how, for that specific show, you were able to sort of create those 4 different worlds. Now, can you please describe the 4 worlds before going into them? So the first is New Orleans.
New Orleans, second is Chicago, third is Hollywood, and fourth is New York City.
But and each one has a different. So just even more macro structure. So what happens in each chapter regarding?
So each world is narrated by a wife, and the wife is the column in that chapter. And they have the power of moving the story forward, of explaining things, of popping out, and allow us to be, they are the guide through this. And for each chapter, you know, I had a little bank of information. So in New Orleans, I thought about the food. I thought about the rituals of Mardi Gras and the things that I dwelled on that, and I just wrote them down. And I allowed to seep in my subconscious. For Chicago, I read like Carl Sandburg and that poetry and thought about, you know, early 20th century, the great migration of African Americans moving up the Mississippi from the South to areas like Chicago and Detroit, and read the poetry, listened to the music of that era, and attached the senses to that. The third chapter, Hollywood, even though it's supposed to be like in the 30s, he was in and out of Hollywood, but I just thought about different Black people in Hollywood, the clubs that were popular, what people would drink, the foods, once again, the smells, the senses. And the fourth chapter, New York City, was an older man. You know, unfortunately, I lived or have been in 3 out of these 4 places. So then in New York, I thought about, oh, this is Queens. This is a particular area of Queens. I thought about working class neighborhoods. And so in each of these chapters, you'll notice people mention food. It's a way thing, but it opens up. People will mention catfish, fried catfish in New Orleans. People will mention like a drink in Chicago or salami. And people in Hollywood will mention a certain drink or something. And then in New York City, it sort of brings it back together because New York City is the capital where all these things sort of converge. And so it's very subtle. It's you don't have to highlight it, but characters have this word bank and this bank to operate off of. So when they're stuck, they could go like, I'm hungry for some catfish, you know, and we know like, oh, we're in New Orleans. And then you let that, I'm hungry for some catfish, influence the syntax and the way they're speaking. If someone at Chicago is like, bartend another round, that's a different way of speaking, and they're ordering a different object. It's a completely different feel. It's shorter, it's more succinct, it's more stabbing, and they're stabbing, you know. And so it's this particular type of industrial punching way of speaking. In Hollywood, everything, as I lived in Hollywood, is very airy. It's exaggerated, dreamlike, and you know, a lot of times there's a nightmare behind that dreams, or a lot of lies or darkness or secrets behind that dreams. But people speak in these dream terms because, you know, people moved out to Hollywood to create their dreams and to create this very ephemeral thing and turn them into movies. And so people always talk in these big, beautiful terms in Hollywood, and half the time, you know, it's not true. And then in New York City, it's more brass tacks. It's more a combination of Wall Street, and it's more a combination of Chicago. It's more a combination and a little bit of dreams. But the dreams are more on solid ground in New York City. And so it's more not a city of big shoulders like Chicago, but a city of tight fist. And so using different images of the catfish and the lingerie and the swinging ease of New Orleans, the succinct railroad sort of syntax of Chicago, the airiness in the bright, beautiful, maybe sometimes delusional manner of speaking in Hollywood, and then the punching mechanism of New York City. And you have not only a way of people speaking, you have a lot of symbols and visuals you can expand out upon and to create a world. And then these people are the world is rubbing off on them. And so they're speaking in the ways as they rub up against the walls of this world you've created.
All right, so now we know the 4 worlds. So how would you create that golem that is Louie Armstrong, which is somebody that we all know of, right? We all have an idea of him. So guide us through the process of the first act or second act, without giving too much away. But how would you decide what the goals are for each chapter? How would you structure?
Ideally, he has an overlying goal that he isn't completely aware of, that your hero isn't aware of, but they are doing the different tasks to get through it. So Odyssey, he's doing these tasks, but ultimately he wants to get home. But he has to do these particular tasks on these different islands, on the ship, as these different things are happening, but he's trying to get home. And so that underlying river is flowing throughout the entire epic. And for Louie Armstrong, it's a very personal desire and love that is flowing as a river underneath that. Now, the hero has a great talent Odysseus, Oedipus, they have a great talent. And so that talent both complements what they initially want to do, and also it leads them astray from that. So in Louie Armstrong's case, he can play the horn. He has a natural affinity for music and a musical genius that transcends understanding for someone who was born poor, who didn't grow up, learning how to play the trumpet since he was a kid. It transcends that. And so this talent and this desire at first seem to come together. And then at a certain point, the talent and the pull of the world takes him away. And then he's going off on this journey, and the horn leads him to the riverboats. The horn leads him to Chicago. The Great Depression then leads him to Hollywood, where he's able to escape with his horn and his ability that becomes transformed into being a movie star. It isn't necessarily the horn anymore, but the horn is underlying that. And it's like, oh yeah, he's a movie star now. And then that movie starness that came from being a great horn player in Chicago allows him to go back to New York City as ambassador to jazz, ambassador to American culture. So you see how a little boy growing up in New Orleans, poor and Black, learning how to play a horn, becomes a musical genius in Chicago, becomes a movie star in Hollywood, and then becomes the ambassador to American culture in New York City. But there's still that personal goal underlying that. And you see how his talents have zigzagged his journey.
In all of your writing, and that's why I like writing so much, they're very political. And what I like so much, and I'm so proud of A Wonderful World, is that the play is profoundly political. It punches, it really, it's not what people, the Louie Armstrong musical, there's sort of like an idea of it without you not even know what it was about. Just the Louie Armstrong musical sort of, concocts in your mind a vision of what it is, but this is completely different from that because it's so political. Can you explain how the politics sneaks into your work, or how, or is politics is the point of why you write? What is your relationship with politics?
Well, we have our senses, and then we have that extra sense, our fifth sense. And for me, that's politics, based upon the way I was raised, to always pay attention to what's going on at the time in the world. For someone else, it might be another sixth sense you might be attuned to. And so I grew up around a family that would read stuff about Black politics. When I was a child, one of my favorite shows was British House of Commons, Questions to the Prime Minister, on Sunday at the same time as The Simpsons. Most of the time I would watch that over The Simpsons. And I would watch like Margaret Thatcher or Prime Minister John Majors as they're going through this negotiation. In 4th or 5th grade, they assigned us Shakespeare's Julius Caesar to read. Like I said, we only saw 2 plays live, but they assigned us Julius Caesar to read, which is a very dry play. I love that. And so I was like, oh my God, they're talking about the rights and roles of man in a republic. And what is our responsibility in a republic? Most of my peers at the time would like fall asleep when they were reading and had to discuss Julius Caesar. For me, I was like, oh my God, this is relevant to now. What are my rights and roles and responsibilities in a republic as a republic becomes, an empire and loses its charm of being a republic? And so I always tap into what's political and what's going on at the time. It's just the way I was raised. And each one of you have 5th and 6th instincts of things that you were raised with, that if you were to be dropped into the middle of the 1800s, you would ask, can I read the newspaper? Or you would go to the parlor and taste the liquor to see how the liquor is brewed. You all have your own 5th and 6th senses that is also a portal. So for me, it's politics.
But you also have your own way of seeing the world. So it's not only that you bring in the politics of what was happening at the time, but you come in with a perspective and a very clear one. And that for me has been clear in all your works, is that you're not shy about your point of view. You don't try to hammer it in, but you definitely leave traces throughout the play of where do you stand on issues.
Yeah, if it's a lecture, it's boring. So I have a viewpoint in the world, and I always try to challenge it. So I always think, all right, this is the way I feel, but what if I make this character so different from what I'm comfortable with that they're forced into conflict, not only with the world, but with my assumptions. There's certain assumptions I have about Louie Armstrong being a smiling, laughing, happy-go-lucky guy. What situations can I put him in that reveal the subtext behind that laughter, to reveal the subtext behind that thing. And so a play I wrote several years ago, I kept ratcheting up and changing the character because it was boring to me and it was comfortable and it didn't challenge me. And it was a couple talking and I was like, oh, this is boring. I was like, what if I make him a play in letters? I was like, okay. I was like, what if I make it a little boy pretending to be a woman talking to a man via internet? And I was like, okay, this makes me uncomfortable. This makes me this definitely challenges my assumptions about love and what's appropriate. Now, how is that going to fit? And then you let them battle. But always, if I'm comfortable in writing something and everyone's saying exactly what I feel and think, that is a sign that I need to dig deeper or create something more interesting with jagged edges.
That's interesting. So going back to Confessions of a Cocaine Cowboy, which was the last play you worked with us, which is also a world premiere. So, the lead character on that was a murderer, right? It's a man who killed at least 30 people, if not 300, right? And you were walking a fine line of creating a protagonist that, in a way, the audience needed to root for because he was telling a story, but also, this was not a work I thought that sort of like idealized, to a certain degree, and in fact, because that is the issue with stories like Scarface, etc. That then college students will have posters in their dorms, right? But you actually call attention to that phenomenon itself. So you did sort of the two things. You created a lead character who was, together with Billy Corben, that was an antagonist that we were rooting for, and then also brought attention to the fact that we were rooting for. So can you sort of expand that a little bit, and how was that experience?
It's much different when you're co-writing something, and the advantage of co-writing a play is that you could have these debates and these conversations with a co-writer and find that tension. And so I think with Billy, he knows the subject a lot more than I do. He's a genius. He knows all about it because of Cocaine Cowboys and the sequel to that.
Here and say Billy Corben is a co-writer of Aurin in Confessions of a Cocaine Cowboy, but he's also the writer and director of the very popular movie Cocaine Cowboy and Cocaine Cowboys 2 and 3, etc. So continue.
So yeah, looking through the transcripts and talking to him, I just explored things that made me uncomfortable outside of the Scarface thing. So a lot of these people who are in organized crime have very strong prejudices against women, against other races. And so as, a person of color, that makes me uncomfortable. And then I go, well, the easy thing would be to condemn them. What if you get the audience to agree or think about some of these things that they're racist against? What if they're even a little bit conscious of their bias and they use it to their advantage instead of just being, someone who's spewing venom? And I think there are moments when you see the audience of Cocaine Cowboys, they're applauding things that are questionable because someone's saying what they have thought or what someone else has thought in the past that's floating through their head about Miami race relations. It's not necessarily what I believe. In fact, it's something that makes me uncomfortable. So I circle it and I go, oh, that's interesting. How can we present this without turning off the audience? With this case of Cocaine Cowboys, you have Griselda Blanco. You have a woman who's at the centerpiece of this that conflicts with his misogyny. And so that's built into the story. You have this tension, and then you have the wonderful backdrop of Miami and all the political tensions and all the hypocrisy and contradictions and the surrealness of Miami is what we were trying to capture in politics, in violence, and in the drug wars. And you're trying to capture that on stage. We don't have $100 million budget and like exploding cars. You have to do that through language. You have to do that through intimate scenarios. I work for The Good Fight and on Evil, which is done by Robert and Michelle King. And they, of course, their show that made them famous was The Good Wife. And I think the New York Times ranked The Good Wife as like one of the top 10 shows in the last 30 years. And in the description of The Good Wife, it says, what makes this show unique, as opposed to all the other shows on this list, like Breaking Bad, is that the violence is just in the language. It's almost like Shakespeare. These people are talking, and they're lawyers. They're not like pulling out guns and going to war. They're just talking to each other. And it's so brutal and violent what they do to each other with just words. And within the realm of the law, and within a lot of times the rule of law. And so with Rivi, you're looking at, this is a violent assassin. How do we show this without having him like fire a gun in each scene? How do you show the violence metaphorically and with language, with the blood oozing through the door as he makes the agreement with Griselda Blanco? The package that Griselda brings, which is the body parts that from someone she has killed, that's sitting on the guy's table. That's a visual image.
Or he thinks it's what is there, right?
He thinks it's there, and then the blood which comes out of that is almost a fevered dream, a hallucination that underlies the violence that he's getting involved with.
So you now mentioned the violence of language, and really, you know, for you, language is always the tool for which you're writing the world. So let's go back to the first page of A Wonderful World. How do you start to write it? How does, you're sitting down in front of a computer, blank screen, and then what happens?
Well, there are 4 different narrators, 4 different wives, and you try to think about the world they're going to live in, New Orleans, Chicago, Hollywood, New York. And then I try to give them each their different flavor. And then I just allow them a moment to explain out of time and space their world, which is what creates poetry to it. It's out of the realm of explaining. And sometimes that's the best way to write, as opposed to setting it up and saying, what I'm about to tell you is a story about Louie Armstrong. And what I'm about to say is, when I was in Chicago, it's just, you begin in the middle and you let the audience catch up. And that's one of the consistent themes I've been taught for playwriting, for TV writing, and even for literary journalism. You just begin, and the audience then has to catch up to the story. And if you begin with a really charismatic visual, the audience will want to run after that story. And so you have these 4 different worlds that women are describing, that the wives are describing out of context, which woven together create the quilt of the story and the man and the myth that we're about to talk about, as well as their own lives. And so a lot of times, I did this at Gettysburg College, I would have the students, when I was a guest artist there, break up their words. And I would say, choose 10 verbs, and I would have them write the 10 verbs in different boxes. And I would actually have them take a piece of paper and keep folding it and folding it and folding it till they get the smallest piece. And then you unfold it and then you draw lines, and you have maybe like 100 boxes. And so I say, write 10 verbs, write 10 adjectives, write 10 nouns, write 10 these. And then you would say, now draw a line that tells a story between these different adjectives, nouns, and verbs. And then people would write, and all the writing from these exercises was so, I'm overusing this word, but surreal, because people weren't beginning with, I'm about to tell you a story. They were just beginning with this visual image. By the way, the exercise is set on like a river or by a body of water. And you're in this body of water, and you're just thinking of the 10 verbs that strike your mind from this body of water from your childhood, the 10 adjectives, the 10 whatever. And then the monologues people would create from that map they would draw was visual. It was stunning. It broke up their usual mode of speaking. It broke up their usual way of writing, and it added a lift to everything. And you could do that right now. Just think of a body of water from your childhood and go through like 10 nouns, 10 adjectives, 10 adverbs, 10, all the different things you could think of. And then from that inspiration, allow the dream part of your mind, the right part of your mind, which is nonlinear, and which is subconscious and a million times more powerful than the left side of the mind, which is literal arithmetic and adding things up. This part of the mind, the right side, is so much more powerful and so much more aware than what my conscious mind is on a daily basis. And so breaking up the patterns, writing with your left hand, as opposed to your right hand if you're right-handed, taking words and eliminating articles and just using different words and weaving them together will allow you to break up and discover new things about yourself and new pathways that are in you that are usually not explored. So with that, it was breaking them up, breaking up the syntax, allowing them to dwell in that world, and then just going with these images. And then that becomes the quilt of the story and of Louie Armstrong. These 4 different worlds and 4 different images come together, and then they sing a song, A Wonderful World.
So stream of consciousness, in a way, is sort of like your best friend when you're writing.
Absolutely.
So explain a little bit, like how, really, like I just want to imagine you, maybe let's not use the case of Louie Armstrong, but you know, a play that you first had some instinct that you wanted, not a commission, but something that you wanted to write, you sat down, and then how does stream of consciousness go into the page?
Well, I took a poetry class. At Juilliard, you're there for 2 years as a playwright. You're allowed to take any class for free.
You didn't even mention that you went to Juilliard for 2 years. We went straight to the nitty gritty, but yes.
But yeah, so at Juilliard, you're allowed to take classes. I took a poetry class, a nonfiction class. And the poetry class, you would do 7 minutes of writing at the beginning of each day. And a lot of times you don't even feel like it, but someone's forcing you and timing you. You're in a group setting. And so when I'm forced to write, I did great writing then. And I think everyone did, because it gets over my barrier of, I don't have anything to talk about. It's like, just write. And he would do an exercise. He had so many great exercises. I'm trying to remember at least one. He asked us, why do you write? And then we wrote for a minute. And he'd go, okay, next question. Why do you write? And then we wrote for another minute. He goes, third question, why do you write? And then we wrote for another. He just switched up the tone of his question, but it was the same question, like, no, fifth question, why do you write? And we just had to keep answering the question that was delivered at different tones, and it broke apart our usual answer. The first time I wrote it, I wrote this very clean, we're all good students if we're writers. We write this very nice essay like, well, since I was a child, I always wanted to be a writer, and blah, 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 blah. And it's very nice. We tie a bow on it. We tie, 10 seconds left. Now I'm going to wrap it up. And then you expect another question. It goes, oh, why do you write? And you go, okay, I'm going to write further about this. You see, to expound upon this further, and then by the 4th time, you're just so pissed off at him. By the 4th or 5th time he's asking, why do you write? You're like, man, and it breaks apart. Because everyone's been asked that, why do you write? Or what are your inspirations? But then usually people move on. But if you keep asking a character that question again and again, if you keep asking a character, why are you here in a scene? Or what do you want? And you keep asking that to them, they'll give you the nice answer the first time. And then eventually they'll get down to a very carnal, reptilian level when you piss them off enough. And they're just describing like, I want to rule the world. I want to sit on top of a bed of skulls and be whatever the thing is. And it began as like a school teacher. It was like, oh, I just, want to help out people. And underneath that school teacher is this raving desire that then you wrap up back into this character and you allow them to walk around. And you're like, okay, this is an unusual school teacher because we've seen a peek into their mind, into their deep, dark recesses of their mind. So one method of subconscious writing is to ask the character the question again and again. Another method, this sounds very basic, Meisner technique of repeating the last thing a character says, also as a way of annoying a character until they start spewing. And then writing with your recessive hand. So if you have
let's go back to the Meisner technique. You're moving too fast. Let's go to the Meisner technique, because you're giving us too many good things that we need to so try to expand a little bit about the Meisner technique and about asking the character the last thing that they said. Can you unpack that a little bit? So
at New School, we had to do Meisner technique for writing. And our teacher required us to repeat the last thing, whatever the character said, the previous character, whatever they said. That character had to repeat it and then go further with that. So a miser technique is two characters sitting in a room. Hello. The other character goes, hello. How are you? The other character goes, how am I? I'm good. What's going on today? And you go, what's going on today? Well, I think blah, blah, blah. Now you could tell this is at a certain point, not only is it artificial, it becomes very annoying because people don't talk like that. People actually jump around in their dialogue. But what happens when you use a miser technique is that you're forced to have your feet on the ground, moment to moment. You're forced to move forward in this pace that then when you're moving in a pace that doesn't allow you to leap around, you start digging in deeper to what's underneath that. And so miser exercises, actors do it all the time and they make fun of it. Like they repeat the last word, then you repeat the last word, then I keep going forward. And what it's actually doing is getting us to dig our feet in and then start digging and going even further. And then once you go back and look at what you wrote, you eliminate the repetitions. And then you have normal dialogue and great conversation once you've eliminated the repetitions. And it's based in reality and it's based in a firmness that is point by point that you can point to. The other book that is great, I'm looking at a lot of questions. I'm trying to answer these questions through our dialogue. Someone's asking about the jail scene and how to start off things. But the other,
but not just someone, that was Brian Blanco.
That was Brian Blanco, who was fantastic.
Who was the young man who started who started in the show.
So I'll say, in answer to your question, what Brian asked, there's a book called Backwards and Forwards by David Ball, the professor from Carnegie Mellon. And Backwards and Forwards states, you can figure out a story by thinking of the last scene. Whatever that last scene is, what is the most extreme last scene? Now, the first scene should be the opposite of that. And if you begin from the last scene, you can almost walk your way backwards through a story. And when you walk your way backwards, there's only one direction you can go, which is a previous moment. The problem with starting at the beginning and going forward, as we all know, if you've written or done anything, is that there are a million options when you start at the beginning and try to go forward. And it could be scary and unnerving, you don't know where to go. But if you begin at the last moment of Hamlet, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. Then you walk back from that moment, you see the massacre. You walk back from that moment, you see the reason behind the massacre. And as you walk back, there's only one route that you have. And it organizes everything in this book into two things. Everything in drama is a heap or it's a trigger. The trigger is the gun that fires, the heap is the result of that. So everything is either a trigger or a heap. And the last scene in a play is usually the heap. So in Hamlet, it's the heap of bodies that are dead on the ground. What is the trigger for that? Walk back a step. It's like Memento, you rewind, like that movie, rewind. What happened that caused that heap? What was the trigger? And then that trigger had a heap before that. And then that heap had a trigger. And you go backwards through Hamlet or Macbeth, and you discover like, oh, each one of these is either a trigger or a heap, and you're moving forward. And so with Cocaine Cowboys, you begin with the final scene in a jail. You could begin with the scene in a jail, but it has to be very different. And it's triumphant, but in a different way. And he's describing something, but the mood has completely changed. So I know the last scene is him being put away for a long time. And everything falling apart in Miami, in the after effects of the cocaine wars, and Miami as a modern city. What's the first scene? And we walked our way backwards through that. For A Wonderful World, this drove Christopher Renshaw, the director, a little bit crazy. But when we sat in the hotel room, I wrote the outline backwards. And so we would walk through. I was like, here's the last scene. And he was like, this is kind of giving me a headache. And I was like, yeah, that's the point. It's supposed to give me a headache too. It's supposed to break me out of my usual patterns. So I was like, here's the last scene of A Wonderful World. Here's the scene before that. And we talk about it. And we go, now here's the scene before that. And each chapter, we would begin from the last moment of that chapter and walk our way backwards. Once I do that, then I can write an outline going forward. And I've cleaned up a lot of the red herrings and errant past because I've walked my way back through that ending of that section.
So how often do you start a play knowing the ending?
It's helpful if I know like maybe half the time, or I begin it and I'll get an image in my head of the ending. So I wrote a play about Lorraine Hansberry and James Baldwin. And I knew that if this wasn't the last scene, it was a second to last scene. It wasn't the first thing I wrote, but it may have been like the third scene I wrote. And I brought it into my co-writer and I said, this is the end of the play. And he was like, oh my God, this is really powerful. And I was like, now we just have to work back from this. And it actually ended up being the second or third to last scene in the play. But I had the scene of them describing their death, of Lorraine Hansberry dying of cancer, of James Baldwin dying alone in exile, and them describing their death and their last moments. And then I began the play with them telling a joke. So they're laughing and telling a joke and they're smoking and they have this fun. And I guess the last scene came to me the third day working on it, because behind that laughter and joking in the first scene was this terror that at the time they were talking, Lorraine Hansberry knew she was gonna die. That James Baldwin knew at a certain point within this play that he was gonna lose his best friend. And so they're covering that by making each other feel better, by joking. And so you don't always have to begin from the last scene, but if you're working with visual images or moment to moment work and you're steeped in the world and the characters will give you the last scene, or they'll give you some hint of the ending. It'll pop into your head as a non-verbal montage, or as just a pop, and you have to grab onto those pops because it's your subconscious mind giving you a clue. Grab onto that and explore it and write it out real quickly and set it aside. And then you and your mind, as you continue to honor your gift of discernment as a storyteller that we all have, that society trains us to ignore and to discount, as you continue to honor that sense of discernment, you will get a greater sense of awareness and a greater sense of your subconscious. And it will tell you more things. And it will tell you more things on the page. It will tell you more things when you're at night going to bed, when you're talking to your spouse, when you're at work, when you're in the grocery store. You will start getting these little pops. And now you're training your mind to give you clues, because you're not throwing them away like we do most of the time. You're actually like saying, thank you, what is this? Like a child that brings it, like a dog that runs out into the field and brings you back a toy or brings you back an object, rather than saying, get out of here, dog. And then the dog stops bringing you toys. It stops bringing you stuff. But if you honor that, the dog will continue to fetch stuff for you that it thinks you want or it thinks you need. And sometimes it hands you something that you'll need a month later. And you're like, okay, I don't know what this is, but thank you. So never discount a mind that's fetching you stuff. Never tell the dog, shut up or go away or hit it because you're doing taxes. Write it down somewhere.
Right, but we're actually going into sort of the writer's block, I feel, is the inability to trust in your own mind, right? It's a sense of fear that you shut down your ideas. You think that your ideas are stupid. You think that this idea doesn't have a way to go forward, right? So how do you actually trust in yourself enough to allow your mind to go to places subconsciously in the unconscious and sort of like allowing that to move forward?
If the page is too scary, give yourself a little notepad. If the notepad is too scary, give yourself index cards. I love index cards. Index cards are low pressure, they're tiny, and they allow me to jot down an idea. I wrote a hip hop opera when I was at New School, mostly on index cards and literal napkins. And I would go home and then write them out. But if you asked me, write a hip hop opera while going to school, I wouldn't have been able to do it. But if I had a moment, I could think of a line or a funny jingle, I would just write it down, whatever I could get, and then I would save it. I'd put it in my pocket. I was visiting a friend in upstate New York at Bard College during Thanksgiving, and I was like bored out of my mind, and we were walking through this muddy river. And so I stopped and I took out an index card I had in my jacket, and I just wrote down my description of the river and my description of how I was feeling. I put it back in my pocket. I went back to New York City. Time passes, a year, maybe a year and a half passes. I take out the coat, probably the following winter or 2 winters later. And I'm taking out the coat and I reach in and I'm like, oh, there's a note card here. It was a gift sent to me from 2 years ago from my past self. it became the starting point of this play that I wrote that was very visual, very specific, that was based in upstate New York on the Rhinefield, on the river. And I just wrote out my interpretation of the river. I had no idea 2 years ago that this was going to be a play or a novel or to answer Jordan's questions. It could be anything. I had no idea that it was going to be anything. I just wrote out my interpretation of the moment, and then you stuff it away somewhere. And a lot of novelists, like I think Ernest Hemingway or Nabokov, who for his last novel, Pale Fire, he wrote that all on note cards. He wrote it on small little note cards, and he would just shuffle them. And so if the page is too much, note cards and index cards are amazing because you can write 1 million note cards. Today, if you have note cards, I don't know if you can go to the store, you have note cards, write like 10 images on 10 different note cards and set them aside. Look at them tomorrow. Whatever you want to do, write something about a childhood ritual, write your interpretation of waking up in the morning, and then set it aside. And then you'll eventually end up with this drawer full of note cards that you can go through at a certain point, and that will trigger you. And it's like, once again, the mind is fetching something from you, and this time it's fetching it from the past for you in the present.
Well, I think that first of all, it feels like we're just scratching the surface of what it is to write a story. And I think we're going to have to do future sessions where we really go deep into a certain subject, into character writing, etc., because this has been so rich. But now we're starting sort of the final part of this class is where we open the questions to the participants and sort of let them guide this last section. So
just real quick, I saw someone answer.
Now, but if you feel, if you have a question ready, type them out and we'll be reading them out and responding to them.
An index card, I just mean a note card you can get, like the little note cards you could buy in a pack. And if you don't have index cards, take a piece of paper, fold it 4 times, and cut it up.
She said, what did you write on that index card? You
wrote what did I write on the index card? It was a muddy river. It was a cold, kind of gray day. And I wrote my interpretations without articles and without all the connective sentences. I just wrote verbs, nouns, and just glued it together in sort of a jazz improvised way. Like an impressionistic painting with words. And then I just put it in I may have written 2 cards, and I just put it in my pocket.
Okay.
And a lot of times it doesn't become anything. 90% of the time you write cards, it's just like, oh, you look at it years later, you're like, what? But sometimes you'll reach in your coat or you'll reach in your desk and you'll look and be like, oh yeah, this is my childhood. It perfectly encapsulates something with an impressionistic painting. And also the lack of space makes you be impressionistic and makes you be more artistic and less literal.
Jordan was asking before about, when you're talking about visual, what is visual? A question. I think that was for a further comment. I'm a little confused by what you mean by visual. That could be describing an interaction, something that happens, something active. Yes, not only describing what something looks like, right? When you mean visual, you mean not literally visual, but turning something, words or sentences into a visual element. Yes.
Yes, and it could be, going back on tectonics, a moment. So a visual could be a moment, which is a unit of time or a unit of interaction. So for the Converso Crypto Jewish Project, there was a older woman who was Converso Jewish, who discovered later on in life that she had been secretly Jewish this whole time, and her parents were hiding this from her because they were scared of persecution. She talked about candles, and this is over 10 years later. I remember her. Why do I remember this? Because it was visual. She talked about candles and how now as an older woman, she was scared of lighting candles because she might burn down her house. So her grandson would come over and light the candles for her. Why do I remember that? We have a visual of a candle. You have a grandson in the background lighting a candle for a person who's carrying on a tradition, but is scared like, oh, I might hurt myself. And so the grandson is doing that for the grandmother. And that's a visual to me. And I remember just that moment of her describing, I don't actually remember anything else about that interview, except her describing candles and her grandson lighting them for her because she was scared of burning down the house.
Okay, so we have, so there's a couple ways we can do that. This, and Lowell Williams is raising his hand. That's one way we can do it.
Okay.
Or if somebody wants to write a question. So let's go through a couple of these questions, and then we'll let Lowell, we can actually hear him, his questions, and anyone who wants either way will be happy to get through you. So there's a question from Danny. I hope I might not be spelling or pronouncing your name correctly. She's saying, please share with us some extra resources. This is so useful, especially in times like this. By resources, I mean, talking about, I guess, writing exercises or
okay, so the three main books that were the foundation of what my teachers taught me was the Stanislavski books, The Actor Prepares. And so the 3 years at New School Actor Studio, you focus on the preparation, which is based on sense memory. In your memories, your childhood, things you bring up. The second part is at the end of the first year, you build a character. The second year, the character gets inserted into a role. So a character is someone who's crazy, raving around, charismatic, but unless they have a role to play within a world, they're a pointless character. So the character gets inserted to a world. The character, number one, you started with, the golem, you've written your interpretations of your dreams or on it, and now it has a role. And then the third point is, the third year is the character and the role comes into contact with other people living their world, doing roles of their own and how they conflict. But the second book, the second Meisner book, I think we read, I'll look it up, but it's two different Meisner books. There are three, but we read the first two, and it talks about how to do the Meisner technique, and then we'd write from that. Backwards and Forwards by David Ball, Marie-Irene Fornes, and her exercises about childhood rituals. The other exercises we had to write at New School that are based upon our past in the first year was Parents' First Date. That's a really good exercise. So at Gettysburg College and every place else, you ask people, what was your parents' first date? And they go, I didn't ask him. You go ask him. And if you don't know, make it up based upon the information you can cobble together. Go like, I think they were here. I believe they were there. So your parents are the first gods in your life. You actually know more about your parents than they probably know about themselves because they're the first people you came into contact with, whether it's your mother or father. So if they're still around, you can ask them and just get basic details. Who, what, when, where, why.
Or if they're not around, it's a beautiful research.
Yeah, if they're not around, you can imagine them meeting in Havana and where would they meet. And you can go on like, oh, they meet here. She liked roses, so maybe he gave her a rose, or maybe he was selling them. You can be a little bit creative. But Parents' First Date, just you ask your parents who, what, when, where, why. You get the beginning of that, and then you begin writing an interaction between a couple. You rename them, but they're your parents. And whenever I get stuck for a story and I have to deal with a couple, I go back to my parents, or I go back to my cousins, I go back to the people I know really strongly. I just change their race, change their gender, change their name, and they have that same drive and specificity. And the only thing you do extra with this date that your parents are going on is you add one element of theatricality, one element of magic. So in my parents' first date exercise, they kept walking off stage when it didn't work and coming back as a different archetype of Blackness. They kept like, nope, and then they ring a bell and they'd run off stage and come back as like a Black Panther member. And then they continue talking and then someone else would ring a bell, be like, I can't do this. And they run off stage. Another person set their parents' first date in the sorority house that their father was going to call on their mother. And back then in the sorority houses, you had to wait, you had to announce yourself, then someone had to go. And for some reason, her mother's nickname was Nip or Nipper. And so this guy's just screaming, Nip, Nipper, like screaming into this hallway. And someone comes out like, what are you doing? It's like, I'm sorry, I'm looking for this person. Another person added like a narrator voiceover that was them as a baby being born, narrating this date that's happening. So you add an element of theatricality. I did childhood ritual, we talked about that. I love Odyssey stories. So if you do family first summer vacation or vacation you remember the most, that's an Odyssey story. You have the different tropes you can add, the heralds, the gatekeepers when you're trying to go to Disney World, the different things you begin, and you follow the structure of an Odyssey story. And I taught this over a day or two where I talked about memory mythology. And what I had people do was I had them first come in with the mythology they were attracted to. And I said, okay, you're going to tell me a mythology and you're going to be the storyteller. So if you want to dim the lights, if you want to like reorganize the room, if you want to write on the chalkboard, you can do whatever you want. So they would tell their mythology. It could be a comic book. It could be a movie that's epic. It could be a Greek tragedy, whatever it is. Then I would say, okay, now I'd write on the board the different elements of that mythology, and people would add in like, oh, it had this, it had that. We do that for a day. A few days later, I would come in and go, now we're going to do memory. Bring in a memory. And we would go through parents' first date. We'd go through childhood rituals. We'd go through summer vacations. We go through first job, first day at school, these different rituals, these different beginnings you have. And then we write down the elements. Okay, here are the elements of what you're telling. Then you blend them together. You go, okay, memory is actually personal mythology. We're going to use some of the elements of mythology and we're going to put them into your memory. And it's going to heighten it and make it more absurd, more interesting, and it's going to actually heighten your memory. And even though it's going to be less factually truthful, it might be more truthful in its intent and emotion that you're feeling by depending upon these tropes. And I learned this from when I took classes at Medill in journalism. I wasn't able to get into the school, but I could take classes there. Literary journalism was journalists who started using literary fiction techniques. They started adapting like In Cold Blood and, you know, all these different people. They started using the techniques of novelists and then adapting them into telling true stories. So with this, we're using the techniques of mythology and the tropes and the different elements of mythology, and we're adapting them into your memory. And it makes your memory more surreal, more interesting, more funny, more dramatic, and it elevates the story.
All right, so we have quite a bit of questions, so we're going to try to go through them a little quicker.
Lowell was raising his hand for a while.
Right, so let's keep Lowell. Lowell, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, my question basically is, how much does your being an African-American influence your thoughts when you start to write? I ask that question because I often get told by people, you always see things as white and black or from a racial point of view. And I respond, well, that's because that's the way my life is. I'm treated and operate in the world from that. So yes, I write from a Black man's point of view. What is your thoughts about that?
Thank you, Lowell, for your—
Thank you. That's a great question. I write from that as well. I write from my foundation. And like Jose Rivera, I write from my senses, and my senses are influenced by my memory and my experiences. So everything is infused with that. When I think about the first time my dad taught me how to swim, and we were in, not Vizcaya, but what's that beautiful castle swimming area that's in Coral Gables? I can't think of it now. But when my dad first taught me how to swim, that's immediately infused with the fact that a lot of Black children drowned in the canals in our neighborhood because Black people weren't taught how to swim. So my mind immediately goes there because my dad is teaching me a skill that is fun, that is helpful, that's around white and Black kids, and we're in this beautiful area, but it has that beginning point of me. Now I can expand upon that and use that as a launching point, but that's connected to my dad being a lifeguard and him being like, you need to learn how to swim. Too many Black people don't know how to swim, and they get in danger or they can drown. And so that's why we're going to learn how to swim. And so that's where I begin from. Now I can take that story and it becomes, you know, the episode of This Is Us when they go to the pool, because I talked about like whenever the air conditioner would break down, we go to the pool in Florida. And then the differences in different cultures and white and Black people when they're around the pool and the different cliques that form. And that was a launching point, but it just began with me beginning honestly, like, well, this is what I do when the air conditioner breaks down. I go to the pool, we hang out there, and then there are different cliques and different groups of people who hang out. But, you know, you're gonna hang out in the Black clique, or you're gonna hang out with the white clique. People, if you hang out with a white clique, are gonna judge you. And so that's where I always begin from.
That's a brilliant episode in This Is Us. I'm so happy we got to share this backstory to it.
Yeah, it was like, what happens when the air conditioner breaks down? What happens I remember we were in an area that was really, really cold, and the heater was over functioning. The heater was going into overtime. So it was so hot, you had to take off your clothes. And that was, I believe, the Thanksgiving episode where they take off their, like they're in this weird hotel and they're so hot they have to take off their clothes. Yeah. And my, someone I know who's a colleague who has a background as a Hindu, someone who has a Hindu family, for their birthday, they would throw around a ball of yarn and then they would catch it, say what they felt about that person, and then throw it. So if you've seen that episode, they take a sweater that's unraveling and they take it and they throw it to someone. They have to catch it, say how they feel, and then throw it to someone else. And that was from me observing, going to this birthday party. I thought, this is a beautiful ritual of like throwing yarn around. And then at the end, everyone's holding the yarn and you see how everyone's connected to each other through the good deeds and the words they've said. But that was a ritual I learned like 6-7 years ago. And even though I was an adult, I was like, oh, I'm going to use this. I don't know when or where, but I am going to remember this for a moment when it is appropriate.
And what appropriate it was
but he was coming from a Hindu perspective, and that was adapted for a white and black family. But he began from describing, this is what we did as Hindu children.
Amazing. Okay, so we're going to try to go a little bit better and faster through the questions because we're going to give everybody a chance. So Carrie, saying 70-year-old.
Yes, I'm sorry, it's Venetian Pool. Someone mentioned
Venetian
that.
Pool, yes, and David Char in our board chair also made sure we would say it. So it was just saying how important it was as the Meissner technique, and testified that the exercise was extremely powerful. So thank you so much. Andrew de la Plaine, who credited one of the conceivers of A Wonderful World that we collaborated with, asked to describe the difference and difficulty between writing a play on commission and writing something without any outsider restriction, which is, in a way, we spoke about that a little bit earlier. We were talking about those two examples, but it'll be great if you can, briefly, you comment on that.
I think having deadlines and having someone you're responsible to generally makes me write faster. From my background as a reporter, you have a deadline, the paper has to be printed, it has to go out. And so having a commission is, in a weird way, like, we're going to press, you better finish something. And it's the mother of innovation a lot of times when I'm on a deadline or when I have to finish something. I knew I only had a set amount of time for this commission play I had to write in South Carolina about a town of black freedmen in the middle of the Civil War called Mitchellville. It was the first town of black freedmen in America. And I had a month, so I wrote it in a month. I was like, I have a month to write this because I'm going to be too busy. I'm going to really quickly just jot out some ideas, and then we're going to have to go. And I was like, I don't know which way to go, so I'm just going to give people a game or ritual to begin with, which is a guy who is trying to sell his bootleg wine to someone else. And the person's tasting the wine and is like, oh, this wine's terrible. And they're having this conversation about bootleg wine, and they're two black freedmen having this conversation, and then someone comes into town from another town, and once again, like Defacing Michael Jackson, the situation changes. But that was under a deadline. For Defacing Michael Jackson, I had 2 weeks. So I wrote it in 2 weeks. For Obamaology, I had about a week and a half. And so I made up in my mind in the shower, like, I have a full week and a half that's free. This is what I have to do. I'm just going to write it. And I was able to complete it. Obamaology was a mess, but I had a beginning, middle, and end. And then when I brought it into Juilliard as my first play, everyone's like, this is a mess, but there's a beginning, middle, and end here. And Josh Harmon, who wrote Bad Jews, was like, what if you did this? And it completely changed the play. He gave me one suggestion, and and I went in and I ripped it up and changed everything around in a few days. And I had a real completed first play. But I wouldn't have had that if I would have held back and not submitted it. I submitted my mess to review of other people, and they helped me with constructive feedback.
That's
so when I don't have restrictions and I take my time, I have a play I've been wanting to write for years that I think would be beautiful, and it's about an airplane crashing, and I wrote a 15-minute play about it called Free Falling. And everyone keeps saying, like Defacing Michael Jackson, when that was a short play, you need to expand this. And so in my mind, I have these characters, a stewardess and two passengers, and they're very specific, but I don't have a deadline. So I
Or we
occasionally
have
got
a ton of questions.
Yeah.
Let's try to make sure we get through them. So Ilan is asking a great question. If you get inspired to write a story or play that doesn't feel relevant to your audience, do you still go ahead with the publication, or you try to modify the story to make it relevant? Do you think a writer should write relevant content to the times, or just good content?
No, you should write it relevant to you. If you write it relevant and deep enough to you, it will relate to other people. At Gettysburg College, for the childhood ritual exercise, it was a young white girl talked about being bulimic. And I said, fine, write about that. She's like, I don't want to write about a white girl with an eating disorder. I'm sick of those stories. And I'm like, you're not going to write about a white girl eating disorder. You're going to write about you. And so she wrote this play about her ritual, about bulimia. And when she did it, these old white men who are like retired military veterans are sitting in the audience and they're crying. They are shedding tears. And she came up to me and she said, oh my God, what happened? And I said, you didn't write a white girl with an eating disorder play. You wrote a personal story that happened to be about your eating disorder, that made me cry as a Black man, that made an old white guy cry, because you got specific enough. So if you get specific and intimate enough, it transcends your identities. It transcends, and we all relate to it and tap into it.
That's great advice, really, Aurin. Spectacular advice. Carlito Roa is saying, further than the A, B, and C characters, where do additional support characters come from? Do you have any specific technique to decide this?
No, you could do whatever you want in the in-between scenes. So in my in-between scenes, I introduced two new characters. And one of the characters was a twin of a character that was in the first scene. So it was played by the same actor. And then I introduced the person who was changing the scenario, but you just hear about him. So if you want to introduce a new character who's going to be the agent of change, someone can mention them in scene 2 or 3 with B and C, and mention not even their name, but like, this person's coming. And then actors love you because you've given this character a great entrance. When people talk about a character before they arrive, then an audience anticipates, oh, when are they going to arrive? And they could just walk through the door and it's fantastic. And the audience is like on the edge of their seat. So I had B and C talk about D that was coming. And I didn't specify what D's name was. I just said, this person's coming, who is a white boy, is going to change things. And then the character walks in the room and everyone pauses. And there's automatically laughter because we've all been anticipating this. So if you're introducing D or E, you can introduce them by just mentioning them in passing. And it creates anticipation, and that's good drama. When you have entrances and exits, and we have great entrances and great exits, you have great stage drama, and where the audience is like anticipating or waiting, or you undercut expectations.
And as a director, you're always happy when the writer writes good entrances and good exits, because that's your job. And so it's done for you, and it's much better.
Transitions.
So
90% transitions.
It's about transitions, absolutely. So Marcela Hades, who was recently last fall on our stage with the Bridge of San Luis Rey, asked, hey, thanks for this. When you talk about surprising yourself with a dialogue, how do you go into each character's mind in order to speak the way you think they would do?
I mean, you could do a visual. I stick it with a painting, and you have them describe a painting. You have them describe something until it becomes interesting. We did something first year at New School called Private Moments. So we had to create a character, and we had to act out a character in the room with no one else in a private moment. And they said there are only 2 requirements. They can't be masturbating and they can't be going to the bathroom. Other than that, you could do whatever you want. So a lot of times people were eating food. Myself, I was preparing for someone to arrive and eating a little bit. A lot of people were eating food and then watching TV. And then when they felt inspired, they would start speaking. And so if you isolate a character and allow them to exist without tension, what would they say? And if you're like, they wouldn't say anything, I'm like, give them some food. What would they eat? Well, they wouldn't give them a drink. What would they drink? Water. Okay, how are they going to drink this water? Are they drinking it out of a thimble? Are they like, you just begin asking questions, going like, all right, this private moment, this character's isolated. What are they doing when no one's watching? And then when you get a character who's doing something when no one's watching, you get to the heart of who they are. And then when you put them back in the scene, you have an idea of who they are because you've had them in a private moment talking aloud or eating or cooking food. No masturbating or going to the bathroom.
It's interesting because those are sort of the two exercises where the writer and the actor sort of overlap. Because a private moment, it's a very, it's an actor's exercise, but it also can be a great writer's exercise. And I've always felt that, when the writer is a good actor, he or she creates much better characters, right? Because they
That's
go.
cool.
Really
We all had to do it. We all had to be in acting class. Directors, writers, and actors all had to do these exercises. So I had to stand up there for 30 minutes and do a private moment. And I was like, I have no idea what I'm going to say. I'm just going to go through this and discover a character. And then afterwards, I got feedback from my peers about, oh, I saw this, I saw that. This is what's interesting. Another exercise that you could do, this is maybe more experimental. We would do painting exercises where we would take a painting and then we would reenact ourselves popping out of that painting. So for me, I did Van Gogh and I had to buy like the blonde beard. I had to buy the straw hat. I had to buy the cob pipe. And you strike that pose that you see in the painting. This was a self-portrait of Van Gogh. And then you come out of that pose and you begin operating. And then at the end of the exercise, you restrike that pose. And other people did great. They did the pointillism of Sunday at the Park, of like the woman holding the parasol, and then she turns and starts speaking. So you have artwork all around you on the walls, online, that are actual characters that are frozen in amber. And you could always just take them out of that amber, like Jurassic Park, take a needle into the painting and extract their DNA, put them into a golem of a few words, and then have this woman with an umbrella walking around in 21st century America from Sunday in the Park. Have Vincent van Gogh walking around as a Black girl in Carol City. What would they talk about? They would talk about their ears. Maybe that would be, oh my God, my ears look so cute today. Now we know that it's an inside joke because we know as writers it's Vincent van Gogh, but she's just talking about like, oh my God, are my ears cute? Or what do you think of these earrings? And people are like, girl, you were always obsessed about your earrings. No one has to know that this is Vincent van Gogh except for you. But it is a starting point for this interesting Black girl who is like, wants to pierce her ear 50 different ways, who wants to in some way self-mutilate as a form of beauty, which is what Vincent van Gogh did.
All right, so Jonathan Blanco is saying that thank you so much for this class. He's writing because he's writing songs, but it's helped him so much to develop and to create a setting and a motif. Lisa is saying thank you so much for sharing your time, knowledge, and experience. Jay Amanda is saying yes, thank you. This has been amazing, full of great nugget of knowledge. Oliver Gorf, a local theater maker, says thank you so much for sharing your insight and thank for organizing this. Stay healthy, everyone. All right. Jordan is saying, no, you've already answered a couple of my questions. Thank you. But asking this again, can you use the Meisner technique or the repeated question exercise in writing that is not character-based, not a play, like a novel or a memoir? Can you use those techniques to unearth your own assumptions about what you're writing?
Absolutely. But you could just use any of these techniques for anything that is performance-based, you could use them for character-based, I should say, you could use them and just explore. I mean, F. Scott Fitzgerald's first novel, in the middle of it has like a play for like 10 or 15 pages. And it has another section that's poetry. And he was experimenting with like, I'm going to write a novel, but I'm going to make a play in the middle of it. For some plays, you read, there's a novel in the middle of it, or there's a poem that someone reads. So I would say definitely explore that. It may become a novel, or it actually may be a section within your memoir that reads like a play. And people go, oh, this is interesting. This is what makes it different and stand out.
Aurin, thank you very much. You have absolutely personally have inspired me. I'm going to sit down now the rest of the afternoon, if the kids let me, and start to write something because it was extremely wonderful to hear you speak. The audience, the participants were outstanding questions. I just want to give a heads up of what's next. Next Tuesday, March 31st, from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m., we're going to have extraordinary acting class with Peter Romano and Bryn McManamy. I always pronounce her, I butcher her last name. I know them both well. Peter, not only starring in our production of Terror, but he also directs all of our student performances, the tour for 27 different public high schools here in Miami. He's an outstanding director, an outstanding actor. The two of them are married, and they're going to be going through great American playwrights from Tennessee Williams to Sarah Rule with actual exercises, and they're going to show technique, etc. And then the final of the first 3 series, and we're going to announce the next series today or tomorrow, is Chris Renshaw, the director who collaborated with Aurin Squire in creating A Wonderful World. He has created many original musicals, work with Queen to create We Will Rock You, and directed that show, worked with Boy George to create Taboo, and so he's going to talk about those experiences as well. And I hope you continue. I am sure, we'll make sure that Aurin comes back to do a second class, a more specific class, because it was just unbelievable, Aurin, just to hear you speak. I know you, we've been friends for more than 5-6 years, but really, you surprise me every time we meet, every time we talk. You always, you always inspire me, always surprise me. We love you as a playwright, and thank you so much for taking the time today to joining us.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you everyone for joining this first class. I will say, like I said, I grew up in South Florida, and I only saw 2 plays as a kid. They influenced me tremendously. I'm excited that now, because of Miami New Drama, Zoetrope, that children don't have to just rely on like one Shakespeare play every 10 years to see, or some sustenance. So there's actually a base they could go to of a local, proud, very well done theater in South Florida, like Miami New Drama and many other places now. And I hope people check them out when we are off this hiatus.
That's a good way of explaining where we are now. It's a hiatus, absolutely. A hiatus of life. Aurin, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope you come back for the next lecture. Thank you one more time.
Thank you.
Bye.